As of this week, Trump has declared the ceasefire with Iran on life support, and yet the most dangerous development in this conflict is not the one being discussed in any briefing room in Washington or debated on any network in Tel Aviv. It is something quieter, something far more methodical, something that, when it finally arrives, will not look like the wars we have seen before. It will not begin with a roar, it will begin with silence, the silence of ports that no longer function, of roads that no longer connect, of runways too shattered to receive the aircraft carrying the supplies that keep armies alive. And when that silence falls, the most advanced military force in the Middle East will have, at most, days before it begins to consume itself. Pay very close attention to what I am about to tell you, because this is not theater. This is arithmetic. There is a conversation that serious military analysts have been having in private, one that the political class on both sides of the Atlantic has been too distracted, too invested in comfortable assumptions, or perhaps too frightened to have publicly. It concerns what Iran has actually been doing these past several months, beneath the surface of the missile barrages and the intercepted drones and the dramatic satellite imagery that fills our news cycles. Because when you strip away the theater and examine the operational behavior with the cold eye of someone who understands how modern armies actually function, not how they appear in press releases or campaign speeches, but how they actually function, what they consume, what they depend upon, where their fragility truly lies, a picture emerges that is not merely alarming. It is, for those willing to see it clearly, genuinely, clarifying. A modern army does not run on courage. That is a sentiment for monuments and eulogies. A modern army runs on logistics, on fuel measured in hundreds of thousands of liters per brigade per day, on ammunition consumed in the thousands of rounds during hours of sustained fire, on food and water and spare parts and medical supplies flowing through an invisible architecture of ports and depots and roads and rail lines, without which the most sophisticated weapons system on Earth becomes, within days, an expensive and immovable piece of metal. The Roman legions understood this. Napoleon learned it catastrophically on the road to Moscow. The Wehrmacht discovered it in the steppes of Russia, and now, in the ancient contested land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, we are watching an adversary that has studied this lesson with extraordinary patience and precision begin to position itself to apply it. An advisor to Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps stated publicly that Iranian facilities are so enormous that they have yet to demonstrate the majority of their capabilities, and that Iran possesses sufficient strike capacity to hit Israel every single day for 2 years without exhausting its arsenal. Read that sentence again, not weeks, not months, 2 years of daily strikes, and yet the conversation in Western capitals remains fixated on air defense intercept rates and Iron Dome statistics, as though the question of whether any given missile gets through is the fundamental strategic question at stake. It is not. The fundamental question is this: what happens when Iran stops aiming at military bases and starts aiming at the infrastructure that allows those military bases to function at all? ACLI data from the opening weeks of the 2026 conflict shows that Iran's missile attacks against Israel were sustained across multiple days, even as Israel conducted continuous airstrikes against Iranian launch facilities. Tehran absorbed the pressure. It did not stop. It probed, it measured, it assessed Israeli response times, identified gaps in coverage, cataloged which targets produced which defensive reactions. Every volley was simultaneously a weapon and an intelligence collection instrument. The operational patience embedded in that behavior is not the behavior of a regime acting from desperation. It is the behavior of a state that believes time and targeting selection are on its side. Israel has 3 major ports through which external military supplies arrive: Haifa in the north, Ashdod on the central Mediterranean coast, Eilat on the Red Sea. These 3 facilities collectively represent the circulatory entry points of Israeli military sustainment. They are not merely logistically important. They are existentially important. Without functioning ports, Israel cannot receive the bulk ammunition shipments, the heavy equipment, the aviation fuel, the enormous tonnage of material that sustained military operations require, and the targeting question Iran has been answering through its probing strikes over recent months is not whether it can hit those ports, it is whether it can destroy specifically the infrastructure required to offload cargo. The cranes, the fuel lines, the rail connections, the bonded staging facilities, in sufficient numbers and with sufficient precision that maritime resupply becomes impossible regardless of how many ships Washington dispatches. This is not speculation. This is pattern recognition derived from observable Iranian operational behavior. The question is not whether Tehran has developed this capability. Based on everything the evidence shows, it has. The question, and it is the question that should be keeping every serious strategist awake at night, is when and under what conditions they will choose to use it. If this kind of unfiltered, serious geopolitical analysis is what you come here for, if you believe the world deserves more than comfortable fictions dressed up as expert commentary, then subscribe right now. Because what comes in part 2 is the part that Washington does not want you to understand. As Trump declared the ceasefire on life support, and the Iranian parliament speaker responded that the Islamic Republic's military is ready to teach a lesson to any aggressor, the truly sophisticated observer notices something that the news cycle, by its very nature, is structurally incapable of capturing. It is not the rhetoric that matters. Rhetoric is the noise that powerful actors make to manage domestic audiences and signal resolve to foreign ones. What matters is the geometry of the targeting, the specific, systematic, deliberate pattern of what Iran has chosen to strike and what it has conspicuously chosen not to strike. Because in that restraint lies the most important military communication Tehran is sending, and almost nobody in the Western strategic establishment is receiving it correctly. Consider the arithmetic of military logistics at the operational level, because this is where abstract strategic theory meets the irreversible physical reality of armies in the field. An Israeli armored brigade conducting active operations does not consume fuel at the rate of a civilian commuter. It consumes approximately 180,000 liters daily, accounting for tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, self-propelled artillery, engineering vehicles, and the logistics convoys that supply the brigade itself. Multiply that figure across the number of armored formations Israel currently has deployed, and total daily fuel consumption runs into millions of liters. Israel's forward units maintain fuel stocks sufficient for perhaps 3 to 5 days of operations. That buffer exists to absorb short-term logistics disruptions. It is emphatically not designed to sustain military operations when the logistics system itself has been severed at its source. Artillery presents a parallel mathematics. A single artillery battalion firing at sustained rates can expend hundreds of rounds in a day. Across all artillery systems deployed, daily ammunition consumption during active operations runs into thousands of rounds. Add tank main gun rounds, anti-tank guided missiles, mortar ammunition, precision-guided munitions for aircraft, and the total daily consumption figure is staggering in its scale. The forward ammunition depots that hold these stockpiles exist to enable operations to continue while rear area resupply flows. If the flow stops and the depots themselves are targeted, if the magazines are burning and the trucks cannot move because the bridges are down, then what an Israeli unit has in its immediate possession at the moment of interdiction is precisely and exactly all it will ever have. And once consumed, gone. Now understand what Iran's targeting logic, when and if it shifts to logistics infrastructure, actually means in sequential terms. Phase 1 would not aim to sink ships dramatically in blue water. It would aim to destroy the specific mechanical and civil infrastructure required to move cargo from ship to shore at Israel's port facilities. Container cranes, fuel offloading systems, rail connections, bonded warehouses. Destroy those systems, and the ships waiting offshore are irrelevant. Their cargo is inaccessible. Phase 2 would not waste munitions on individual vehicles moving through the country. It would strike the infrastructure those vehicles cannot bypass. Bridge crossings on primary logistics corridors, rail bridges, highway overpasses, and tunnels that represent unavoidable choke points. When you destroy a bridge, you do not simply stop the vehicles currently crossing it. You stop every vehicle that needs to use that route until the bridge is rebuilt. And in a nation the size of Israel, with a limited number of major north-south and east-west corridors, destroying multiple bridges simultaneously does not create a traffic problem. It creates a strangulation. When Iran shut the Strait of Hormuz following the February 2026 U.S.-Israeli strikes, it demonstrated precisely this logic of infrastructure as warfare, severing not armies directly, but the arteries that feed them. The strait closure was a proof of concept at the macro level. Applied at the operational level against Israel's internal logistics network, the same concept becomes a vice rather than a blockade, tightening incrementally, invisibly, until the force that depended on that network can no longer sustain itself in the field. Phase 3 is the most unsettling component of this analysis, and it is the one that most directly challenges the comfortable assumption that classified information provides security. Israel maintains a dispersed network of forward logistics depots, hardened facilities containing pre-positioned ammunition, fuel, and supplies designed to sustain military operations when rear area logistics come under pressure. The locations of these facilities are among the most closely guarded secrets in Israeli military planning. And yet, Iranian strikes in recent months have repeatedly struck facilities whose military functions were not publicly acknowledged. Facilities where satellite imagery subsequently revealed ammunition storage bunkers, fuel tank farms, pre-positioned equipment. That targeting intelligence does not accumulate by accident. It represents years of systematic intelligence preparation of the battlefield, human intelligence, signals intelligence, commercial satellite imagery analysis, conducted with a patience and thoroughness that Western assessments have consistently underestimated. And then there is the compensating mechanism that American planners instinctively reach for when confronted with logistics vulnerability. Emergency strategic airlift. The United States maintains substantial heavy airlift capacity. C-17 Globemasters and C-5 Galaxies capable of moving enormous quantities of cargo over transcontinental distances. But strategic airlift requires functioning airfields with runways long enough and structurally sound enough to receive heavy aircraft. Iranian strikes during the 2026 conflict closed Israeli airspace for several days, disrupting operations at Ben Gurion and other airports across the country. Iranian planners understand with absolute precision that disabling runways does not require destroying airports. It requires creating subsurface craters of sufficient depth and number on runway surfaces to prevent heavy aircraft from landing safely. Achieve that at Ben Gurion and Ramon and the relevant Israeli Air Force facilities. An American strategic airlift, regardless of how many aircraft are waiting on the tarmac at Dover and Travis, delivers nothing. As of May 15, 2026, Iran has declared it has not agreed on uranium enrichment terms with the United States. Nuclear negotiations remain stalemated, and Trump himself has told Tehran it can strike a deal or get annihilated. The diplomatic language is hardening. The rhetorical temperature is rising. And in that rising temperature, the critical analytical question is not whether these two parties want war. Rational actors rarely want war in the abstract. The question is whether the conditions for a catastrophic miscalculation have been created, whether the gap between what each side believes the other will accept and what the other will actually accept has grown wide enough that the next escalatory step lands not on a negotiating table but on a logistics depot that Israel cannot afford to lose. Let us address directly the question that inevitably follows from everything in this analysis. What is Israel's answer? What does the strategic response to a logistics interdiction campaign actually look like? And here we must be honest in a way that is uncomfortable for anyone invested in the narrative of Israeli military invulnerability. There is no good answer. Not because Israeli military planners are incompetent. They are manifestly not. But because the vulnerabilities being exploited are structural, embedded in the physical geography of a small country with limited port access, limited road and rail corridors, and a forward-deployed military that consumes material at rates that peacetime resupply infrastructure was not designed to sustain under sustained precision strike. Israel cannot prevent Iranian missiles from reaching their targets in sufficient volume to achieve logistics interdiction objectives. ACLED data confirms that even under continuous Israeli airstrikes targeting Iranian launch facilities, Tehran maintained sustained missile fire against Israel. The intercept rate is not zero and never was. In a logistics interdiction scenario, the attacker does not need perfection. It needs to damage enough critical nodes that the system as a whole cannot function. A single destroyed crane at Haifa does not stop the port. 3 destroyed cranes plus the fuel offloading system plus the primary rail connection to the inland distribution network may well stop it entirely. Israel cannot quickly repair the kind of damage that a sustained precision campaign against infrastructure would create. We are not discussing pothole repair, we are discussing the reconstruction of specialized port equipment with manufacturing lead times measured in months, the rebuilding of bridge structures requiring extensive engineering, the remediation of runway damage preventing heavy aircraft operations. These are not problems that national will and military discipline can solve in the window of time that matters operationally. The United States cannot compensate through emergency resupply at the pace required. A single large container vessel carries more cargo than many dozens of C-17 sorties. Sustaining an army of 120,000 through airlift alone when the ports are closed and the runways are cratered is not a logistics management challenge. It is a physical impossibility at the relevant timescale. The conditional ceasefire declared on April 8th came only after weeks of devastating exchanges, and talks since then have repeatedly stalled. The ceasefire bought time. It did not resolve the underlying strategic asymmetry that this analysis has been describing. And yet, and this is the point that George Will himself would insist upon because intellectual honesty demands it, deterrence is not the same as inevitability. Iran has not yet executed this targeting campaign. The fact that it possesses the capability does not mean the decision to employ it has been made. Talks mediated by Pakistan continue, and both parties have returned to the table repeatedly, even as ceasefire terms remain contested. There are actors on multiple sides of this conflict who understand the escalatory logic described here and are working with varying degrees of desperation and effectiveness to prevent it from completing itself. But here is what history teaches, and what no amount of diplomatic optimism can fully answer. Capabilities that exist get used. Strategic advantages that have been carefully prepared across years of patient intelligence collection and operational development do not simply dissolve because negotiators are meeting in Pakistani conference rooms. They remain available, they remain tempting, and in any future moment when Tehran calculates that the costs of restraint exceed the costs of action, when the pressure from domestic audiences, from military commanders, from the logic of the conflict itself tips the calculation, the option will be there. what Washington and Tel Aviv owe their publics is not reassurance. Reassurance, in the face of what the